28 chapters in this book. We're supposed to do two per night, and at the rate we're going to have to extend this on and make it a summer course.
You're supposed to be done about 8.
Yeah. I went through last week the first 12 verses of chapter 5. That is known as the Beatitudes. In fact, it might even be listed that way in your Bible. The Beatitudes. By the way, we are in this set of notes, okay? It was the last set that I gave you. It was entitled Knowing Christ the King Through His Public Platform, chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And there are 2 or 3 pages of introduction, which I'm not going to take time to go through again tonight, but we are following this major outline right here in the rectangle. Verses 3 to 12 is the Beatitudes. Basically, for those of you who missed it, in the Beatitude, Jesus is talking about people. The poor in spirit, people that mourn, the meek, people who hunger and thirst after righteousness, etc. Okay? Different kinds of people described by certain qualities. And all of those verses basically look at the kind of person that will end up getting into God's kingdom. And secondly, the kind of person that will be blessed and happy while being in God's kingdom. Let's face it, to be very frank with you, the conditions for being saved are simple. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Right? That's the simple message of the Bible. Especially the teachings of Christ and the apostles. If you want to get into heaven, trust in Christ. Depend on Him. But there are a lot of people that have made that kind of a decision who are going through hell on earth because of the lifestyle that they have adopted, even though they're Christians. And God makes no excuse for it, and He doesn't promise us a rose garden if we make stupid choices. It's not guaranteed. Happiness is not guaranteed to a Christian in this life just because you're a Christian, right? And His teachings on the Mount made it very plain. Blessed are the merciful, verse 7, for they shall obtain mercy. Just to illustrate this point, describes the kind of relationship that I will have, let me rephrase that. Describes my relationship to other people, right? I am merciful to other people. I can't be merciful to God. God is never in a position where He needs mercy, right? Mercy is something that a sinner needs. Somebody who's broken the law. A criminal, right? So, in my relationships to other people, if I show kindness to you instead of a harsh, judgmental, damned if I care attitude towards you, in your problems, if I am not like that with people around me, then it comes back to me. You've heard the expression, what goes around comes around. Well, Jesus was teaching that. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy in turn. Okay? You've also heard the phrase, they that live by the sword, die by the sword. Okay? If you're a critical person, guess how people are going to treat you. Right? And that is an example of the sort of thing Jesus was describing here of His people. Those, I hope, like all of you who, like myself, are believers in Christ. We won't even get in the kingdom if we don't hunger and thirst after righteousness. You have to have a desire for God's truth. Blessed are the poor in spirit. He's describing a person who has come to the end of himself or herself, recognizes, I'm garbage. I've got nothing going for me in my own. And neither is my neighbor. And neither is this person. We look around us in the world, and the world's in a big mess. A lot of people who are putting on airs like they're really something, when in reality, they're nothing. They're ignorant, they're making all kinds of bad mistakes, and they don't see it. And so the threshold for getting into and enjoying the kingdom is becoming poor in spirit, acknowledging my personal poverty, that I'm an absolute sinner, I'm at ground zero, and if I'm going to go anywhere up, I need to grab somebody's hand. That's what Jesus was teaching, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the only kind of person that ever gets into the kingdom, and Jesus is inferring that, you see. Okay? So that's what that section in this sermon is about. Jesus was contemplating or describing the kind of persons who would get into the kingdom and the kind of persons who once in the kingdom were going to be happy as opposed to those that would not be happy. Right? It's a real commentary, it's a real challenge on human nature here. Now, verses 13 to 16, next on this outline that I've given to you are called the similitudes. And they concern the spiritual objectives of the kingdom. Putting this in layman's terms, every one of us has a reason why we get out of bed in the morning, put our shoes on and our clothes, and go out the door. A reason or reasons. Your reason may be no better than, well, I don't want to stay in bed. Maybe you may not have a real conscious, positive purpose or goal in life. For some people, is they're in debt. I owe my soul to the company store, and so that's why I go to the door, right? Okay. Maybe for some people it's pride. They're afraid to not show up because of what people might say or whatever. You don't want to start people talking. For other people, the kind of person that Jesus envisions here is he wants us, people in his kingdom, those who are believers, to have a very different objective for putting your clothes on and going out the door in the morning. Let's read it. How about you guys take turns? We'll just start. Gene, would you start? We'll just read across here. We're just 13 to 16. If you don't feel like reading, don't pause or just pass. Just read those 5 verses there.
Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt is lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men.
Next.
You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden.
Neither do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house.
Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Great. Now he talks about salt and light there. You can see it in verse 13. Salt, you are the salt of the earth. By the way, who is Jesus talking to? The you there is kind of significant. The disciples. You have to back up and go right up to verse 1 to get the context here. I could make this verse say anything I wanted to if I didn't pay attention to the context. Okay? You. Who? My friends. You see? And a lot of people treat the Bible that way. The right way to treat the Bible is verse 1 sets the stage. Jesus was talking to a bunch of people up on a mountainside, and it just so happened that some of his earliest disciples were there too. His earliest believing followers. And so he is speaking these words recorded in this chapter primarily to his intimate followers who are gathered around him like you are gathered around me within earshot. And yet there were lots of people around, and undoubtedly there were people who were hangers-on and curious as to what this rabbi is teaching his disciples. He had school outside, so people would be naturally attracted. And so he speaks, he says, you are the salt of the earth, you followers are the salt of the earth, and he describes that. And then in verse 14, you are the light of the world. Do you buy salt when you go to the grocery store? If you buy groceries, you usually buy salt. You can't live without salt. Well, maybe you can, but not very healthily. Right? Okay. You need salt. Salt's important. We need light as well. Okay? Just got a letter from a missionary named Larry Cole with his wife and 3 or 4 kids. They work in a little island close to New Guinea, Dutch New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, way down on the other side of the world. And in their particular village, they just installed a generator that was purchased by a Baptist church from their hometown in southern Ontario. And the villagers are all happy because for the first time ever, they have light after dark. You know, light bulbs in their village. Okay. Now it's second nature to us. You know, you don't even think twice about it unless there's a power failure. But light's kind of important, right? Our lifestyles would be tremendously different if we didn't have light, artificial light. So salt and light are essentials for practical living. They're important. What are some of the uses of salt? Okay, it's a preservative. Back in the days before electricity, right? That's how they stored all their meat, just about. Okay? What else do you use salt? Good, flavor. Right? What else can you do with salt? Sure. As a cleanse, as medicine, as a form of medicine, cleaning wounds and so forth. Painful, but effective. Right? I think what Jesus has in mind here as he's speaking to his followers is that he is using from everyday life 2 commodities that are useful commodities. They're not just like knickknacks sitting on a shelf, which you could easily do without. Right? We don't need paneling on our walls. Anything will be fine. Right? Those are not necessities, but salt and light are necessities. And he's talking about necessities of life here. Right? Why do we buy necessities? Well, obviously because necessities are important. There's a function, there's a purpose, right? For necessities. And he says then he uses them as a picture of people, and he says, you people are salt. You are like salt. This is a metaphor. You all understand what a metaphor is, right? If I say, you are like my dog, I have used what is known in language as a simile, where I've made a direct comparison. You are like, L-I-K-E, this, right? A is like B, right? But if I say A is B, that's still in language recognized as a figure of speech. It's saying, Jesus said, I am the door. One occasion, he said, I'm the bread of life. I'm the water. I'm the living water. Right? I'm the light of the world. Right? He wasn't a door, a physical door, right? But he has characteristics in the non-literal realm of life that are exhibited by a door in the literal realm of life, or the physical realm of life. See? A door is an entranceway. It also stops, right? It either opens or closes, and it's a means of getting from here to there, right? And so Jesus was using the metaphor to teach that he is the agency, the means by which we get from here to there, right? And it also slams shut in some people's face, right? Who don't want it, or whatever. So he's doing the same thing here. You are salt. In other words, we, Christ's followers, if we are believers, in some sense, we perform the function of salt in this world. You are the salt of the earth, it says. The functions of salt: we cleanse, preserve, and flavor. Can you imagine what this world would be like if all of a sudden all the Christians went like this and were gone? The Bible describes it. It's in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations, and it's a horrific time. Right? The one time in the world's history when there will be no righteous people for a period of time. A period of years, probably. And the world is going to go downhill so fast, it's not funny. Okay? Natural disasters, social disasters, economic disasters, political disasters of every make and kind. Right? The tribulation period. If you know anything about prophecy, the 70th week of Daniel, that 7 years is going to be a really bad time. The only righteous people are going to be people, are either going to be those 144,000 Jewish evangelists that the Lord sends into the world directly at His coming, or after the rapture, sometime in there, and the people that they convert, right, and who survive. A lot of people are going to die, right? And so Christians have a tremendous influence. Even though the world hates Christians and righteous people, if it wasn't for Christians and their values and their presence and their personal influence on those around them, it would be a whole lot worse than it is today. I believe that. And Jesus said, you are the salt. He was stating a fact. You are the salt of the earth. This is in fact the way you are. It's always been this way from Old Testament history, past to the present and on into the future. It's going to be the same way. As long as there are righteous people who are followers of God and of His Son Jesus Christ, their influence is going to impact society. At least somebody will be paying their honest taxes, for example. They're supposed to be. If you're not being salt. Right?
Well, of course, our whole legal system is set up in Christians where Christians.
That's right.
That's how it runs.
That's right.
Even though they're those who are trying to change that, still.
Excellent example. Can you imagine what our world would be like if we didn't have a justice system like we've got? It's basically based on the Bible. Okay? That there is right and wrong, A. B. That right should punish wrong, etc. Okay? Not all societies in the world have that. Anyway, we could spend a lot of time on this. And Jesus said, if the salt is lost its savor, then what's the use? It's good for nothing. Might as well just throw it out. There's a lesson there for us as individual Christians, and that is, Jesus said we are in the world for this purpose, and by definition, this is the way we are, whether we like it or not. If you're a Christian, you can't avoid having an influence on other people. I was a pretty quiet Christian when I was in high school because I was kind of intimidated by the crowd of non-believers that I was in. I did invite the whole bus of young people a few times when I first moved here to young people's for 2 or 3 months when they found out it was religious. And by the way, the whole bus came. That first year we were here, I used to stand up and invite them, all the young people on the bus. And so we used to have 70, 80 kids back when Goulais River was smaller, 25 years ago. We only had one bus going from here to town. And but that lasted for about 3 months until they found out it was religious. And they backed out. Okay? But and I never really did a whole lot of preaching, but at the same time, everybody knew who the Clocks were, and they knew what this place stood for, and the rumors and the stories all circulated. It was just the nature of the stories was don't mess with those people up there. God's on their side, That's just the kind of thing you hear about once in a while, right? Strange stuff. But it illustrates the sort of influence you have. If you're not one of them, they know it, right? They know it. Right? And they might not want to hear what you have to say, but you are automatically influencing them whether you like it or not. And sometimes it bugs them. Remember the story of Noah in the Bible? He was called the preacher of righteousness. What did he do? Well, he basically built a boat for 120 years. Right? He was, by the very fact that he was building this boat instead of drinking with the buddies down at the local zoo or bar or whatever, right? And being just like them, it says he condemned the world by his own righteous actions. See? Non-saved people look at you as a Christian and you are a threat to them automatically just because you stand for something different than they stand for. And there's an influence there. You're being salt. just because of who you are. Even if you never open your mouth, you're a threat. That's one of the reasons for animosity against Christians in this world. And Jesus said this is just the way it is. I mean, we don't choose this. It's automatic. You believe the truth, that's the way it is. Accept it. Okay? And we ought to live consistently. There are lots of Christians who get kind of tired of it or whatever, and they try not to act like salt, even though they are. Of course, then even the world loses respect for people like that. They're hypocrites. You're the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. If we turn the lights out in this room, open the curtains, you can tell we're Sault Ste. Maria's right now. Right? You notice the yellow haze in the sky, right? Sure. Again, perfect illustration of what a Christian is like. Right? The people of God's kingdom. God has designed the situation such that if we are in His kingdom, it shows unavoidably. And therefore we have to choose to live accordingly. Don't run from it. Embrace it. It's absurd, is it not, to turn your flashlight on and then put a cover over it? Right? People don't light a lamp and put it under a bushel. Right? He says you are lights in this world, by definition. You're a Christian, you're in my kingdom, you're a light. It's like you're a torch. Okay? And so the whole point of this whole passage in the similitudes, where he draws a similarity between two things to us as his people in his kingdom, is stated in verse 16. There's a reason why people go buy salt, and there's a reason why people buy flashlight batteries and put them in their flashlights, because they do it to use this stuff. There's a purpose, there's a goal, right? Let your light so shine before men that the men may see your good works, A, and B, ultimately that the men will glorify your Father who is in heaven. What is my reason for getting out of bed in the morning? A, that I will live for the Lord by living for people the way I ought to live. Okay? Now, I want to make enough money to live, right? Pay the bills and stuff. That's automatic. In fact, he's going to talk about that more when we get into chapter 6. Okay? About the daily grind business, right? But my real purpose for being is, if I'm in his kingdom, my real reason for existing is to get up every morning and serve men in such a way that they will recognize God, right? And be drawn to him. Now, here's the question. Is this why you get out of bed in the morning? Right? Is your life characterized by these two objectives? The spiritual objectives of the kingdom. You know, there's nothing in my mind more absurd than to reject God and to live your whole life trying to make money or to have fun, because you are automatically, you know before you even begin that you're going to be defeated. Why? Because someday you're going to get too old to enjoy money, right? Or your possessions. Life is like that. It's terminal, right? And if that's your whole reason for being, to have fun, someday you're going to be in a position where you can't have fun anymore, where you can't use your money, can't take it with you. So then why did you live your life? All you can say, if you lived your life for material or physical objectives or purposes, is that, like Frank Sinatra, looking back on a life lived for himself, he says, I did it my way. I had fun too. I really enjoyed getting drunk. And I really enjoyed, going to bed with these 5,000 women and on and on and on, right? He can brag about what he did in this life, but what about when you come to the end of it? What was the real reason for being? There's got to be more to life than just sort of existing. And when they wake up standing before their Creator, then they will realize that they missed the whole point. Right? We are going to meet our Father who is in heaven. Something a little bit inconsistent about people that believe in God but don't want to live as if there is a God. And since we, as God's people, believe A, there is a God, B, we believe that He's going to reward us or for our obedience and judge us for our disobedience, right? Maybe we ought to realign our own personal motivations every day to fit in line with His, which are spiritual. That doesn't mean that we can that we need to go through life like prune faces, sad and, beating ourselves, flagellating ourselves with sticks and rods and stuff, to keep ourselves from enjoying anything in life, like lots of so-called religious people have done over the century. But that's stupid too. That whole misses the point, Jesus Christ said, I came to give you life and that more abundantly. He wants this life to be enjoyable for us, and He wants our eternal life, our spiritual life, to be enjoyable too. Okay? So why are you living? What is your reason for being? Think about it. This is really practical stuff. Jesus was saying, if you want to be in my kingdom, it's more than just making money. It's living before men in such a way that men are drawn to me through you. Okay? That's your reason for being. Okay? Influence people like Saul. Shine. Send a message out there. You know what light is? What is light? By definition, what is light? What constitutes light? Oh man, I've been out of high school for a long time. You're an engineer. What is light? It is something that it's energy. It's a form of energy, isn't it? Isn't it by definition light a form of energy? I'm a little bit out of my realm here. Isn't the spectrum? The visible is composed of X number, but it's all waves.
7 various lights, and there are different wavelengths that make the light, whether they're blue, white, orange, red, whatever.
But actually, you can extend it beyond the visible spectrum.
Yes.
Right? And it's still the same thing. It's still wavelength.
It's still there, even though you can't see it.
That's right. Way up here you have the gamma rays, right? X-rays. Way down here where you have ultrasound or infrared, whatever. Okay? I told you I was out of my element. Okay. Right? And here's my point. Okay? Light has been hard. The principle of being able to tap in and use light waves at all parts of the spectrum has been accomplished in our society just in the last 200 years. Right? To be able to use it, you use it for illumination, right? Use it for heating, use it for diagnostic imaging, all kinds of stuff, right? And for communicating, that's what radio and TV is based on, waves, right? Sends a message out there, right? So, in a real sense, Jesus was, he was no dummy. I never inferred that he was. But being God, he uses a very apt illustration. As salt, one of our literal jobs as Christians among men is to purify and preserve and cleanse as salt. Literally. And clean up this world. Right? And as lights, the basic function of a wave is to carry a message. It carries a message of some sort. See? What's our message? Christ. Right? We preach Christ, crucified. Right? Right. Now, I probably spent more time in the similitudes than I wanted to. Let's go to the comparisons. This is the bulk of the message. It goes from verse 17 in this chapter and goes all the way to the end of chapter 5. If we can get through this, I'll be real happy tonight. I'm sorry, it goes through chapters 5 into chapter 6 and chapter 7. Comparisons. The comparisons are simply a number of specific instances or subjects that in which Jesus makes a contrast between something his listeners have heard about or know about and what he wants to teach them. Okay? And let's look at them one at a time. Okay, the three main divisions are given to you at the bottom of one of these pages here. The comparisons fall generally into three categories. Social duties go to the end of chapter 5, religious observances halfway through chapter 6, and personal values from 6:19 to the end of chapter 7. Let's talk about the social duties, the ones mentioned in chapter 5. How about we read verses 17 to 20? That's the first comparison is found in these verses. James, did you read those, please?
Think not that I am come to destroy the law, or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall on no case enter into the kingdom of heaven.
Anybody willing to hazard a statement as to what the main point of this section is? Just reading through it one time, what do you think he's really saying here?
I think that basically trying to show that those that thought that they would have righteousness because they followed the law. In fact, that the law does is show what's wrong, and he is here to provide the true way to get to heaven. You can't get there by the law. So.
Okay, I agree. I think that Jesus was contrasting an attitude of religious people towards their way of trying to get to heaven, as opposed to something else, the way you really get in. Okay, let's make sure we clarify our terms. Okay, here's the Bible. This is our Bible. Okay, our Bible has how many books? 66 books. In Jesus' day, how many books did this Bible have? I'm sorry? 39 books. Well, actually only 22, but that was just because they divided the books up different in the old days. Okay? And so the Old Testament, that is the first part of this book, the Bible, from here to here, was the Bible of Jesus and the people that he spoke to. But there was a section of their Bible that was the bulk, that was the main part. Their Bible was divided into three sections. Anybody know the names of the sections? The first main section was made up of 5 books called it's mentioned right here. Or the law, yeah. 5 books of law. Okay, Matthew, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All right. Now, the Hebrew word for law is Torah. Right. All right. Then the middle section of their Bible is known as history. It incorporated some historical work and stuff. The writings, it was known as history and poetry and stuff got stuck in there. Okay. All right. So they had the Torah. They had a section called the writings. And then the third section was the prophets. Okay? This came first in history, and this stuff follows. Right? Sort of intertwined. Okay? Because the writings gave a summary of the Jewish history from way back when, and the prophets lived during this history. Okay? But the writings were divided this way into the messages of the prophets as opposed to the sort of historical circumstances of the prophets, which writings were. And all of these three sections composed the Jews' Bible. Now, the word, this section was the foundation to everything else. Right? God revealed His laws to Moses. Right? That was like the foundation. Okay? And then the writings and the prophets were sort of built on top of this foundation. Okay? This was foundational. Because it was foundational, you could take this, they commonly did. They took this phrase or this phrase and they used it to refer to the whole. Okay? It would be like us referring to the New Testament as the Gospels. You see? But that's characteristic of what they did. And in this passage, when Jesus is referring to the law, that's what he's referring to. He's really referring to the Jews' written Bible, the whole Bible that they had. But he uses this term to refer to it. Okay? That's the first thing we need to recognize. The second thing is that he's talking about the guys who are on the wrong side, scribes and the Pharisees. Verse 20. I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Pardon? Right. Absolutely not enter into the kingdom of heaven. There were people that looked at this and they said, there's stuff here that you have to read between the lines. Right? If you've never studied the Bible much, then it isn't going to make sense to you. But there's something that has happened in history that needs explained here. Okay, Jesus was speaking these words about 30 A.D. Okay, on a timeline. Let's just put a timeline down here. Well, not 30 A.D. Say 27 A.D. Jesus died in approximately 30 A.D. He was born over here. By our calendar, it doesn't make sense, but it was 4 B.C. Right? Now, let me just read you a couple things out of his book here. This is entitled Exploring the World of the Jew by a fellow named John Phillips. And he talks about their books, what was basic to the Jewish religion at the very time that Jesus lived. And it wasn't this. Okay? This is what's basic to the comparisons here that we don't understand usually because we didn't grow up in a synagogue and we don't know this stuff. Okay? Okay, here's a little bit of review. He says the Torah is the Jewish name for the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. It's their word for the law. Jewish life for centuries has revolved around the Torah. But for the most part, it has been a Torah buried beneath vast accumulations of tradition and entrusted with enormous deposits of human interpretation. The Torah itself has been largely superseded in Judaism by the Talmud. The 5 books of the Torah can be written out in 350 pages. The Talmud takes up 523 books. This is a theology, right, that supposedly came from here. Okay? Listen to what it says. The Torah is clear and concise. It's part of God's inspired word. The Talmud is wordy, rambling, argumentative, inconsistent, sometimes witty, sometimes boring, sometimes brilliant, sometimes inane. The laws of the Talmud constitute cold concrete poured over Jewish life and hardened by time into rigid prison for the soul. The Talmud contains more than law. It has songs and sayings, a bunch of fables and fancies, wisdom and wit. The Talmud became the race memory of the Jewish people. It became a talisman to them. Here's what composes the Talmud. We've got, there are 5 books in the Torah, and in the Jewish Old Testament there were 22 altogether. There were 17 more books in these other 2 sections, for a total of 22 books. In the Talmud, they started out with what was known as the Midrash. The Midrash was around in Jesus' day. In fact, it started to be written about 400 BC. And the Midrash was basically like this book right here. Commentary on the Bible. The Midrash is like an explanation of parts of the Old Testament. Okay? So the meanings of this book were recorded in this book. Sorry. Okay? Let's see. By 30 BC, another book had begun to be written, and it was known as Mishnah, the Mishnah. And it too was an interpretation of these books in the Jewish Bible, but from a whole different slant. This was from a Jewish perspective, a traditional Jewish perspective, and this was from a Greek. This was very logical, right? They went to this and they reread it logically and they wrote their ideas down. This was done differently. There was another book that followed that was known as the Gemara, and it was these 2 books that this book concerned. This was a book that was written to interpret these 2 books. Okay? And this was finished way after Christ's time. Now, here's the whole point I want you to see. These two things right here were in existence in Jesus' day. And they were in the process of being written down even in Jesus' day. Okay? For many years, the rabbis didn't want it to be written down because they were afraid that it would take the place of this. And rightly so. And when it did, today, if you were to go downtown on Bruce Street, you walk in there, on the Sabbath, on Saturday, they'd still read this. But you know, the meaning, they are not allowed to draw their own deductions from this. Any teaching that takes place in the synagogue down on Bruce Street, the Beth Yaakov congregation, has to fit this stuff. Because this is Jewish identity. And if you take any interpretation that doesn't fit this, they'll kick you out. You understand the point? So the real authority for Jewish life today, as it was in Jesus' day, was not this, but this. This is like, if to use a modern parallel, if you were to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, they come to the door carrying a form of the Bible. Right? It's a perverted form, but they've got the Bible, and they won't talk to you about the Bible, right? And if you keep talking to them about the Bible, sooner or later you and that person are going to run into difficulties because they do not have the freedom to interpret the Bible for themselves. If they start drawing the conclusions that you draw when you read the Bible for yourself from the text, they're going to run into a problem with this. In the Jehovah's Witness organization, what is the name for this? Watchtower. See? Everything that a Jehovah's Witness has to believe comes filtered to them through the Watchtower. Right? They can't draw their own conclusions. I know a guy that did. His name is Joe Urshan. He started to read the Bible for himself. He started to challenge the things that he was being taught by the Watchtower because he found some inconsistencies and contradictions. They kicked him out. And they destroyed his marriage in the process. Yeah. And all cults do this. They substitute another authority for what is actually written in the Bible. Roman Catholicism does the same thing. What's the name for this authority that is really the authority for Roman Catholics? I don't know what the missile is, but
Just a little small form of the Bible.
okay.
You had the mass right in the beginning, and then you had the apostles. What is that?
Apostolic Creed.
I can't remember. It's like
Matthew 15. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, who were of Jerusalem, saying, he had a question, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? Right here. The tradition of the elders, the oral law. How come they don't do things like our books say they should? They don't wash their hands when they eat food. Right? A big deal. But he answered and said unto them, why do you also transgress this, the commandment of God, by your tradition? You see? Jesus said, your oral law totally misses the point of this. Okay? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother. He's quoting from this. Okay? Honor your father and mother. And another place, he that curses father or mother, he should be put to death. But you say here, okay, in your oral tradition, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Now, I'm not sure I can fully explain that, right? But I think that what they have done in here is saying, well, as long as you bring an offering to the temple, right, and you give a gift, it doesn't matter how you treat your parents, right? They're feathering their own little treasuries here, okay? And so they, in essence, had cut this out by their own little rules. Jesus is another example here. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draws near to me with their mouth and honors me with their lips. Profession is great, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, taking for doctrines the commandments of men. Still happening today. In cult after cult, after church after church, after group after group, anybody that doesn't let people study this for themselves and makes them believe the writings of some third party between the person and God's Word has substituted a man-made authority. Now, I recommend that you buy Ryle's book. But if we find something in that book, we're not throwing Matthew out, we're throwing Ryle out. You understand? We advocate studying taper systematic theology here, and Hodges and Strong, and different guys. We use a lot of books, but it's not our authority. Right? It's simply there for reference. Okay? It helps us understand things, but sometimes there's stuff in those books. There's a lot of books out there that are right off the wall. Okay. Let me give you one ridiculous example, then I'll quit. By the time of Christ, the Mishnah had already accumulated vast prestige, and its custodians, the rabbis and the scribes, were held in veneration by the common people. Jesus swept the whole Talmudic myth aside as vain tradition, Matthew 15, saying that it made the commandment of God of no effect. It was for this, as much as anything, that these guys determined to get rid of Christ. For example, in place of the concise statement of the Mosaic law regarding the Sabbath, read that in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, the Mishnah spelled out some 40 different kinds of labor that were forbidden. This book said that keeping the Sabbath, which this book said, meant that you couldn't untie a knot, you couldn't sew 2 stitches, you couldn't light a fire, you couldn't carry anything from one place to another. In Matthew 12, the Lord's disciples were accused of breaking the law because they plucked some grain while passing through a field on the Sabbath. In the rabbinic view, right here, they had violated the Sabbath prohibition in their interpretation against reaping because they had plucked some grain, A, and they had further broken the Sabbath prohibition against threshing because they had husked the grains before they put them in their mouth. So they had both reaped and threshed on the Sabbath to get a mouthful of grain. Such prohibitions connected to the Sabbath were taken by the rabbis to fantastic extremes. In these books, a tailor could not take his needle into his hand just before nightfall on Sabbath Eve because he might forget he had it and go with it. Carrying his needle would be work and a violation of the Sabbath. It was forbidden to read by lamplight on the Sabbath because the needle might tilt the lamp and that would be work. A person could go out sucking on a candy on the Sabbath day only so long as he placed it in his mouth before the Sabbath began, and so long as it was only done to keep his breath sweet. But if the candy fell out, he could not put it back in his mouth because that would be work. The rabbis would debate for months over whether a person could wear a false tooth on the Sabbath. Whether he could wear it if he needed to eat better, whether he could eat just as well without it, whether it was to be worn solely for cosmetic purposes, and if so, whether such wearing was forbidden by the law. These rabbis discussed for 9 years one simple statement found in this book up here. Thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. It's found in the book of Leviticus. No doubt what was meant was probably originally aimed at some idolatrous Canaanite practice. The rabbis over here, centuries later, lacking that insight, decided that this simple prohibition needed expansion. In the end, they concluded that milk and meat must forever be kept separate, for the slightest trace of one could contaminate the other. Even vapors from a pot containing beef could contaminate the very kitchen where the milk was being used. And so what they were doing is making laws that govern Jewish life even today. What these guys came up with here in their fantastic interpretations of observing the Sabbath here, found here, resulted in what is known as a kosher diet. That's what it's all about. The kosher junk came from these screwball interpretations of the Bible that had nothing to do with it, really. And you come across the New Testament, and the New Testament says all that diet stuff was only meant to make the people unique for a time period anyway. You can eat anything you want today. Okay? So there's an example of what was behind all this stuff. When we go through these contrasts here in this chapter, what Jesus is doing is, look at it for yourself. Go back to Matthew 5. I said I was going to let you go. I'm going to. Verse 21. Matthew 5:21. And 22. Look at the first phrase in each one of those verses. You have heard that it was said. You hear with your ears. You hear something oral. The oral law. Verse 22. But I say to you. And what Jesus was doing, it says, you've heard this, but I say to you, the spirit of this. Okay, over and over. Look at verse 27. You have heard that it was said. Verse 28. But I say to you. Verse 31. It has been said. Verse 32. But I say to you. Verse 33. You have heard that it has been said. Next verse. But I say to you, etc. What he's doing is contrasting the oral law. You had to get this background to get the significance of what Jesus is doing in this passage of the chapter, part of the chapter. Okay?
I mean, these people are done.
Okay, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 20, which we've already read and touched on, gave you the background that Jesus was making comparisons to the law of the mind of the people to whom he was speaking, as opposed to the true law of God that they possessed, but they had really kind of ignored. And the scribes and the Pharisees are the guys that were responsible for this transition here. And that's why he says, in this first section, he said, look, I don't want anybody to get the idea that I'm against the law. Right? Verse 17. Do not think that I am come to destroy the law. And this was one of the charges that the scribes and the Pharisees threw against him later on in his life. Oh yeah, you're coming around to destroy our law and our customs and all this. They threw the same charge up in the face of the apostles. That was only partially true. He was come to establish this law and to destroy that law. Okay? Jesus' answer was, I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Not one jot or one tittle shall in any way pass from the law until all be fulfilled. The Hebrew language is made up of square characters. If we were to draw them on this line, this is Aleph, Bey, Gimel, Dalet, He, Waw, and Zayin, Kaf, Tav, Yod. Smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, jot. Right? Not one jot. Yeah. Or one tittle. The vowels under the well, there's all different kinds of little dots and diddles right in Hebrew. Between this word and this word, a lot of times they put a little line right there. Okay? And this just shows that this word has a dependency relationship on this word. Okay, that may be what he means by a tittle, right? Or the vowels in Hebrew, these are all consonants, and the vowels go underneath here. So if you wanted to write Rick's name, it would be, this is an R sound, and this is an I sound, and this is a K sound. This is Rick. They go from right to left. Okay, so this could be what he means by a tittle. Okay, jot and tittle. And it makes a big difference, by the way. You change this, and you come up with a different word. If you went from rith to ra, I mean, even in our language, if you change the if sound to a s sound, you've got two different words. Rick is one thing, rek is another. You understand? And so just by changing just these little tiny marks in the Hebrew Bible, Jesus was saying, not one jot or one tittle, any of these other little marks, will ever pass until it's all fulfilled. Okay?
I have a question. Well, that till all is fulfilled. You mean it's something? Maybe things change after it's fulfilled. That's something I've often wondered about. See the last right at the end says, "Till all be fulfilled."
Yeah.
Does that mean in the fullness of time when things are fulfilled? Something could change. I mean, why would that be?
Well, I think we've already seen it today. The necessity of keeping some aspects of the ceremonial law are found in those 5 books.
Yeah. Oh,
That's passed. It has passed because it's been fulfilled in Christ.
Oh, all right. Okay.
But there are predictions found in the law that haven't yet fully been fulfilled. See? And so Jesus was saying, look, that is the authority. What God revealed in the scriptures, that's rock solid. It's not going to pass away until it's all fulfilled. I didn't come to destroy it. I came to fulfill. Right? And so he was establishing which side he was on here, and then he was talking to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees had a very easy-handed attitude towards the scripture, just like a lot of preachers do today. A lot of denominations have we'll take this part, we won't take that part out of the Bible. Okay, look what he says in verse 19. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. What he seems to be hitting on here is that there are some people that say, don't worry about all that other stuff. This is the thing. Yeah. Okay? So they selectively pick out the parts of the Bible that they will accept and which they won't accept, or what they will do or what they won't do. Okay? And Jesus is saying you ought to be listening to people that teach and also perform the very same things that they teach. Right? All these commandments, not just the ones they select, okay, but have a broad-based dependency on all the scriptures. There have been counted approximately 614 commandments found in the law. You'll always find people today that, most of the people in our society are only concerned with not very many people in our society anymore bother with even 10. The 10 commandments. Right? Okay, there's an example. Right? If you narrow the number down to say 3, let's just worry about 3 commandments, then there's a better than average chance that most of us would make it. You know? If going to heaven meant keeping 3 commandments, then maybe we could do it. Just from a human perspective. Right? But the more you add, the less likelihood, right, that you'll ever make it. You're raising the standard, right? And this is essentially what the scribes and Pharisees did by writing out the interpretation that they did. They boiled it down to today. If you talk to a Jewish leader, religious leader, they believe all of this stuff, but they have sort of relegated that as passé in practice. And today it's just be good. Treat your neighbor like you'd like to be treated. It's a good works religion today. You know, and if there is such a thing as heaven, you'll make it. Right? That's the kind of attitude. I have a book down in my library that's a modern day, it was 1970s, and it just has excerpts from the writings of different religious leaders of different denominations and groups. It's got a Jewish guy, 2 Jewish guys writing and answering questions. You know, what does a person have to do to make it in your own religion or whatever? You know, answers to those kinds of questions. And the guys say, basically, it's just be good to one another. Right? That's it. Okay? But that's the modern descendants of these people. Okay? Now, it's true, Judaism is fractured. You have the right-wingers and the left-wingers. Even today, if you go over to if you and I got to go to Jerusalem today, we could see the right-wingers. They all walk around with those great furry hats, you know, the funny-looking hats, and they let their side curls grow. You know, the real ultra-orthodox, and they throw stones at you if they make tourists put proper clothes on to walk through the southeast corner of the city of Jerusalem, so they don't offend their religious viewpoints and stuff. Yeah, if you want to go visit the Roman wall, you got to put clothes on that, you know, women can't wear shorts and stuff, you know, whatever. I said all that to say this. Jesus said, except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of these guys, you will in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. By human standards, they can set the rules so that you're okay. Let me give you an example of a guy that belonged to these people. Let me just read it for you. You don't need to turn there. Philippians chapter 3. This fellow that wrote this belonged to these people before. He says, at one time I had a lot of reasons to trust in the flesh. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day, just like all good Jewish boys. I was of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, was touching the law, a Pharisee. In other words, I was a conservative right-winger, concerning zeal, persecuting the church. I was very zealous. Touching the righteousness which is from the law, he says, I was blameless. I attained their standard. I kept all the rules of the club. And I was one of their buddies. See? He was in good standing in the club. A Pharisee. See? But then he says, but then I got saved. See? Because the human standard is always much lower than God's standard. Okay? And that's what Jesus was saying here. The contrast. First basic contrast, we've got 2 laws. By God's standard, based on Scripture, it's an impossible standard. Right? Your righteousness has to be much greater than the righteousness of Pharisees who go by this standard over here, the man-made interpretation. Where does this kind of righteousness come from? Where do we get the kind of righteousness that
Through the blood of Christ, shed blood of Christ.
to get? Right? You can't work for it. God has to just simply give it to you on a golden platter. It's yours if you believe in my Son. Okay? Read that in Romans chapter 5. Righteousness comes by one man, Jesus Christ. And that's what Jesus is inferring here. First major contrast is we've got 2 systems, 2 standards. This is the right one. Your righteousness has to be so much greater to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Okay, that's what it's all about, getting in. Second contrast in verses 21 to 26 is that in this oral law, these people acknowledged that it was wrong to kill. You have heard that it was said by them of old, thou shalt not kill. And that's a quotation right out of the Ten Commandments. And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of judgment. Jesus said, I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. I have something to say about that. Okay? He was going to contrast something to the oral law. See, what these people, they'd walk around and they had a hateful attitude, right? They held grudges. They slandered people. Insinuations. They were malicious, gossip mongers. They hated you with all their guts at times, right? They could have this attitude, but they were okay. They never broke the law because they never murdered anybody. Okay? Now Jesus was pointing out an inconsistency here between fact and spirit, you see? And this is what he says. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment. Whosoever shall say to his brother, and he uses an example of an epithet, an abusive statement, like, think of something that isn't nice to call somebody. That's what he's talking about. Shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Jesus is saying, sure, your law says thou shalt not actually slit anybody's throat. That's fine. That's good. But I say to you, it's the spirit of the law, the reason that's in there, it's much deeper than that. It's not just on the surface level of actions, but it's the spirit as well. How do you talk about people? What do you call people? What kind of hateful attitudes do you have to one another? Calling people down in public and, despising people. This is what he's talking about here. Yeah? A grudge is just a long-standing hate, isn't it? You got a hate on for somebody? And hatred is just basically murder without actually doing it. If you think about it. Right? I hate you. You can picture it, right? So he continues in verse 23, if you bring your gift to the altar, if you're going to do something religious, and while you're doing that, it comes across your mind that your brother has something against you, Jesus' advice is, stop your religious practices and go find your brother and fix it up. Right? In other words, deal with your attitude first before you start carrying on as a religious person. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly, while you're in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge. Okay? Jesus is teaching here the simple principle, even though the language sometimes is difficult to explain word for word. I think everybody here can recognize that he was saying, look, it's okay that your oral law supports the traditional law, the biblical law, thou shalt not kill. But the spirit of that original law in God's Word was not merely to be applied on the legal level, but also on the interpersonal, emotional level as well. Okay? If we would all practice this, our society would be a whole lot better off, right? Sure. Questions on that? One law was anti-murder. The true law, God's law, is anti-murder, but it's deeper than that. It's anti-anger. That's why I put the heading that I did there for you. You know. The next section, verses 27 to 30. This law says one of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay? Now, these guys had taken that commandment, and they'd amplified it and so forth, and they were still teaching this, and they were still upholding that on the surface. Thou shalt not commit adultery. You have heard that it was said by them of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, Jesus isn't against being against adultery. He's not pro-adultery. He's against adultery just as much as they were, but it went deeper than just the physical act. I say to you that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has also already committed adultery in his heart. That's a pretty tough standard right there. Much higher standard of morality in the spirit, if you take the spirit of the law into consideration, than just the fact of the law. These guys were anti-adultery and pro-divorce. This law made provisions for divorce because of the hardness of man's heart, and these guys just developed it. And by Jesus' day, there was two schools of thought. I mentioned them before. Shammai was the real conservative. Hillel was the liberal. Shammai taught that the only grounds for divorce in Jewish society of Jesus' day was, if you had an unfaithful partner. The liberal guy, Hillel, and his followers taught and practiced that adultery was for any and every cause. Just about anything went. Men had all the rights in first century Jewish society. Okay, women had very few rights. They were considered to be chattel in the Oriental. Right? Now we must understand this from their perspective in the first century. And so Jesus is saying, look, the law was against not just the act of adultery, but the spirit of it as well. Okay? In the New Testament, I mentioned this in your notes. If you've read the notes, then you'll get it. But in the New Testament, there are two words. One of them is pronounced lasciviousness, and another one is pronounced concupiscence. Right? Those are old English words that have long since become obsolete in current language in English. Lasciviousness is defined by the experts as stirring up within yourself or in other people desires that can't be satisfied within God's limits, having no moral limits. Concupiscence is defined as an abnormally strong sexual desire or appetite hung up on or preoccupied with sex. And if you want to, all you have to do is just look in the New Testament, book of Galatians, chapter 5, talks about the works of the flesh are lasciviousness and all these things. And the Bible, the New Testament, the rest of the New Testament is a commentary on Jesus' words here that prove that what Jesus meant was that Jesus' standards are shooting at your heart and at my heart and in my mind and in your mind, and teaching us that if we're in God's kingdom, God wants the subjects, the citizens of His kingdom, not to just be acting on a right level in the performance, right? And be hypocrites on the inside, but He wants our external to match our internal. He wants our spirit to match our actions. So just because He doesn't want us walking around bragging that, well, I've never committed adultery. Meanwhile, we're lascivious-minded, right? He wants them to match. Okay? He wants a clean heart and a clean lifestyle. That's a big problem for most people in our society, because our society has gone right off the deep end on this stuff. Okay? And I personally had a great deal of difficulty growing up in this society and being able to maintain a pure mind. It's really difficult. I really struggle with that. Right? Carried a lot of guilt over the years and struggle inside of me as a Christian on the outside, wanting to live right and appear right, and on the inside struggle with the temptations that are normal to humanity anyway, and then surrounded by people, and advertising and movies and television and everything there. All these forces are against it.
Well, sure. When I was at work, there would be 30 magazines, like Playboy, Tennis, whatever. All. So I'm sure when you were in high school, the guys have the real offers and stuff like that. You understand where you can't,
Yeah.
it's a hard thing to act in the same manner as you want to be seen.
And to even think in the manner that you want to be seen as. Okay. So what Jesus is really shooting at here is the spirit of the law. And he wants us to be pure in mind as well as in body. It's hard. And yet that's the requirement. That's his standard. Okay? Anything less than that is hypocrisy. You think about it. Okay? And by the way, these guys were amazing. There's a story found in the 8th chapter of John where these very guys, scribes and Pharisees, brought a woman who was caught in adultery, it says. In the very act, they said to Jesus. Now, I don't know what they did with the man, but they brought the woman. Now, maybe he was one of their friends. Now, I don't know. Like, it doesn't. All we can do is read in the lines. But these guys got this poor woman, that was in bed with somebody. And they jerked her out of there and hauled her across town to where Jesus was to make a public example. And the law was on their side because she was caught in the act of adultery, right? And Jesus forgave her and let her go, and told her to go and sin no more. Once you're forgiven, then okay, let's go from here. Right? Let's not sin any further. Okay? But in the process, he made all of those accusers. He said, well, okay, the guy who is in this group who is sinless, you can cast the first stone. Right? He'd already written something on the sand, and then he bent down and he wrote on the sand again. Whatever he wrote convicted every one of those guys because not one of them threw a stone at this adulterer. Okay? And I'm quite sure that he probably wrote their names. It says they went out from the eldest to the youngest. Why did they leave the eldest to the youngest? Probably because he put in order from the eldest to the youngest their crimes, right? Their secret sins in the area of morality. That's just a guess hazarded, in between the lines of the context, but it sure makes sense. Especially when they never brought the man. Right? Who knows? Maybe it was a total, like it could have been a really bizarre setup. Maybe they were the ones that were committing adultery. And they just used this poor hapless victim to try to trap Jesus, their worst enemy. I haven't read a commentator that suggested that, but it could have been. And so this is the sort of inanity that was carried on in the name of Pharisaical righteousness in Jesus' day. These people that were, just across the line in good man's land, right? Never really committed the acts, but they were sure watching the other people and enjoying it, We didn't quite finish that section. It says, let's read it. If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. To be truthful, these are two of the hardest verses of the New Testament to interpret. And I don't really have an answer. I don't know for sure if we can take everything in these two verses literally. They need to be taken in their context, and Jesus is talking about controlling our thoughts. How do we get filthy thoughts? Through our eyes, right? And how do we perform? How do we act out our filthy thoughts? Through our members of our body. And so what I think is what it's pretty. It wouldn't be hard to say that these two verses are pretty exaggerated verses, right? And there is a figure of speech known as hyperbole, which is you just take something and you state it too much to make your point, and I think that's what he's doing here. And I don't think he's advocating, this would be my interpretation at present, that I think he's using hyperbole here to make his point. Be careful about how you let it in, and you careful what you do. Okay? Your eye is how we see most of the temptations, how we get most of our temptations, right, to immorality. And our hands. You know, it's pretty hard to commit adultery without any hands, right? It's pretty hard to do anything without any hands, right? Which well represent the members of our God. Okay, the members of our God. Now, the other side of this is the marriage, divorce, and remarriage thing. Verses 31 and 32, he comments on this, and it's sort of the flip side. It's intimately related to this business of morality and adultery. Again, he compares the oral law, the oral law position as opposed to the spirit of God's law position. It has been said by the oralists, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. He is obviously generalizing here, and he is making a statement that would have satisfied people from either school, Shammai or Hillel, because they both believed in divorce for at least one cause. So he raises the subject, and he says, and here's Jesus' position on the subject, I say unto you, and he is interpreting the spirit of God's law found in the Old Testament scriptures. Whosoever shall put away his wife, and he's focusing this towards men, except for the cause of fornication, causes her, the divorced woman, to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. In other words, what happens when married people divorce is that man separates them, and man's laws say you can now remarry. And what that does is then this person who is separated from the original husband, and used a wife for example, then is an agent free to remarry from the human perspective. When that happens, when that person remarries, then that person has married someone else when they've already got a living spouse in God's sight. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Read it in Matthew chapter 19. God's position is there shouldn't be any divorce, nor should there be any remarriage, because when there's divorce, then it sets the stage for remarriage, and remarriage is adultery. In God's sight.
Answer the exception for the cause of fornication. If Jesus is accepting that.
Right.
So then what you're saying, in this case, you have a right to separate, but you can't do that. Is that what you're saying? Right.
Well, people that, like this is like opening Pandora's box. You can spend 3 hours
miles
on it.
into this. It's just that because he's made this, I've often wondered why he made that exception.
Right. Okay, I'll just give you the different viewpoints on it. Okay, viewpoint A is that Jesus was accepting the school of Shammai position, which is the conservative position, and he was rejecting the liberal position, which was you can divorce your wife if she doesn't cook good, right? You know, just anything goes. You know, you can just get rid of her and get somebody else, right? That was the school of Goulais, and Jesus was identifying clearly here with the conservative position that there's only one real legitimate cause, if any, and that is the fornication. We can all identify with that. We can understand, you know, those poor guys, you know, the poor lady, you know, innocent victim of a philandering husband. Okay? That's the commonest interpretation today that's held by evangelicals. Okay? That what Jesus was saying was, yep, you're free to remarry in that case and in that case alone. Okay? I believe that's an erroneous interpretation, even though it sounds good, because Jesus was talking to Jewish people. And in their law, God's law, Deuteronomy chapter 22 and 24, the will of God regarding fornicating people is explicitly revealed in about 6 different scenarios. And in every instance but 2, fornicators were to be stoned to death for fornication. And so the exception then becomes a non-exception. See, if the person under Jewish law had committed fornication, automatically they were put to death, which automatically freed their spouse to remarry with no problem. This is the Jewish law.
I never thought of it like that.
Yeah. And most people overlook that. The context of, Jesus was actually in the process of contrasting God's law to the oral, rotten interpretation of God's law. And Jesus was clearly saying, well, if I had to identify with anybody today, it would be at least your conservatives. There's only one cause, for divorce, and that is fornication. But then in God's law, if you go back to read what God actually said in Deuteronomy chapter 22, in every instance but 2, and those 2 instances were for unmarried people, right? Where in one instance, if a girl was raped in a place where nobody was around, and even if she had screamed, nobody would have heard, that's considered rape. Wasn't the word rape isn't found in the Bible. The word fornication is used there. Okay, and so the guy who fornicated with this woman was then forced to marry her under Jewish law without the right for the rest of his life ever to divorce her, which most Jews had. Divorce was an option for most people by law, but not in that case. Okay, and that only applied if they were both unmarried. Okay, if the rapist was married, then he was put to death, right? Because that was adultery. And I forget the other example, but this becomes a non-exception, really, and that's how I see it.
I understand.
Now, I really wish that we had more time to talk about this, because I have never in my life talked to a Christian who has gone through divorce and or remarriage that really wanted their children to go through that experience. Usually it's not a happy experience. But there's really strong emotions attached to this, and if you just sort of stand up in the pulpit and start preaching on it, you hurt people's feelings because they think that automatically you're talking about them and you're picking on people, so you just about can't preach on this stuff publicly.
Yeah, but it's important.
Well, it is.
It's important because that's my position. If I wanted to be an elder, I couldn't be an elder because of that.
Yeah.
Because I'm remarried. It's important to me to know the truth.
And truth should be taught, but so we have to pick our times and places for teaching on this kind of subject. Right? And so I've been doing it for 6 weeks or more in Sunday school, because there have been some people really interested in the question. So we're just sort of finishing up. But, anyway, Jesus was talking to the people who had some pretty lax views on it, and he was standing against it, and saying, you people have taken God's word, taken a too liberal position. It's wrong. If you go back to this, black and white. Okay. Well, 9:05, gotta quit. Pick up here next week. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I could stand the 12 o'clock.